The morning began the way too many mornings had begun lately, with the kind of quiet that came not from peace, but from the absence of options. Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of the motel bed, the springs beneath her protesting softly as she shifted her weight. The room was small and smelled faintly of cleaning solution that had been used too sparingly to cover what it was meant to hide. Outside, traffic hummed along the highway, an endless stream of people moving toward destinations that felt impossibly distant from where she was. Her daughter, Emma, lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. The fever had broken during the night, a small mercy that Sarah had learned not to take for granted. 7 years old, and Emma had already spent more time in emergency rooms than any child should. The diagnosis had been delivered with the clinical precision doctors used when they wanted to communicate facts without absorbing the weight of them. Chronic condition, ongoing treatment required, costs that would accumulate faster than Sarah could manage them. She had managed before. Barely, but she had. There had been a job, then another, then a series of jobs that paid just enough to keep them moving forward without ever quite catching up. Then there had been the eviction notice, the final warning from the landlord, whose patience had stretched as far as it could before snapping back. The apartment had been small and drafty, but it had been theirs. Losing it had felt like losing the last piece of solid ground beneath her feet. The motel was temporary. Everything was temporary now. She paid by the week with money she earned cleaning houses, walking dogs, taking whatever work appeared on the apps on her phone that still functioned, despite the cracked screen and the battery that drained faster each day. She rationed everything: meals, medicine, hope. Some days the rationing worked, other days it didn't. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating against the cheap laminate surface. She reached for it slowly, bracing herself for bad news. Most calls brought bad news. Bill collectors, appointment reminders for visits she couldn't afford, messages from people she owed, explanations she didn't have. The number was unfamiliar, local, but not one she recognized. She hesitated, then answered, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Emma. "Ms. Mitchell?" The voice was male, formal, so with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering information without inflection. "Yes," she said. "This is Gerald Hastings from Hastings and Associates. We're handling the estate of Thomas Mitchell. I understand he was your late husband's uncle." Sarah's mind stuttered over the words. Thomas Mitchell. The name surfaced slowly, attached to a vague memory of a man she had met once at a family gathering years ago. Older, quiet, the kind of relative who lingered at the edges of conversations without contributing much. She remembered him leaving early, remembered her husband mentioning later that Uncle Thomas preferred solitude to company. "I think so," she said carefully. "I only met him once." "Yes, well," Hastings continued, "Mr. Mitchell passed away 3 months ago. He left no immediate family. According to his will, his property is to be transferred to you as his closest surviving relative by marriage." The words landed strangely, not with the weight she expected, but with a kind of hollow confusion. Property. The word suggested value, substance, something worth inheriting. But Thomas Mitchell had been a recluse, a man who owned nothing anyone wanted. "What kind of property?" she asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of papers being shuffled. "A military facility," Hastings said. "Decommissioned, approximately 40 years ago. It's located about 80 miles north of your current address, near the old industrial corridor. The structure itself is in poor condition. Mr. Mitchell acquired it decades ago for nominal consideration. The estate transfer will follow the same terms." "Nominal consideration?" Sarah repeated. $1, Hastings said. Symbolic payment to complete the legal transfer. You would assume ownership, along with all associated responsibilities. Taxes, maintenance, liability. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. This was not a gift. It was a burden being passed from one person unable to carry it to another, equally unprepared. "I don't have $1, she said, and the admission hurt more than it should have. "The estate can cover the filing fee," Hastings replied. "But I should be clear, Ms. Mitchell. This property has been abandoned for decades. There's no utilities, no infrastructure. The county has considered condemning it multiple times. Most people would refuse the transfer." "Then why did he leave it to me?" Another pause. "I don't know. The will simply states that if you decline, the property reverts to the county. Why, it will be demolished, and the land sold at auction." Sarah looked at Emma, still asleep, her small face pressed against the pillow. The fever had broken, but it would come back. It always came back. And each time it did, the cost of managing it climbed higher. "What would I do with a decommissioned military facility?" she asked, though part of her already knew the question was irrelevant. She had nothing. A collapsing building was still more than nothing. "That's entirely up to you," Hastings said. "The structure is sizable. Some people have tried to convert similar properties into storage facilities, though the costs are prohibitive. Others have attempted to salvage materials. Most simply walk away. And if I accept it, then it's yours. All of it. Whatever value it holds, whatever problems it carries." Sarah closed her eyes. Her sister had warned her about making desperate decisions. Her mother had stopped calling altogether after the eviction, unable to watch her daughter's life unravel from a distance. Everyone who had once offered advice had slowly, quietly stepped back, until Sarah was alone with her choices. "I'll take it," she said, and the words felt less like a decision than a surrender. Hastings gave her instructions, paperwork to sign, a time to meet at his office. The call ended with the same formality it had begun with, leaving her sitting on the edge of the motel bed, staring at a phone screen that had gone dark again. Emma stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Mom?" "I'm here, sweetheart." "Are we going somewhere?" Sarah looked at her daughter and forced a smile that felt more like a mask than an expression. "Maybe. We'll see." The drive north took longer than expected. Sarah's car, a sedan held together more by routine maintenance than by any remaining structural integrity, protested the highway miles, with sounds that grew louder as the distance stretched. The landscape shifted gradually from urban sprawl to industrial decay, then to stretches of empty land where nature had begun reclaiming what people had left behind. She followed the directions Hastings had given her, turning off the main road onto a secondary route that narrowed into something barely wider than a single lane. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into uneven patterns. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt packed hard by years of neglect. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, and watching the trees pass. She had been quiet since they left the motel, asking no questions, offering no complaints. At 7, she had already learned that some journeys were taken in silence. The facility appeared without warning, emerging from the tree line like a monument to forgotten purpose. It was larger than Sarah had imagined, a sprawling complex of low buildings connected by crumbling walkways and surrounded by a chain-link fence that sagged in places and had collapsed entirely in others. Rust climbed every surface, staining concrete and metal in shades of orange and brown that spoke of decades spent exposed to weather and indifference. Sarah stopped the car near what might have once been a gate. The structure hung at an angle, its hinges broken, its metal frame twisted. Beyond it, the main building loomed, its walls streaked with water damage, its windows either boarded or shattered. Graffiti marked the lower sections, faded tags and symbols left by people who had passed through and found nothing worth staying for. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. No traffic, no voices, just the faint whisper of wind moving through empty spaces. "Is this it?" Emma asked, her voice small. "Yes," Sarah said. "It looks scary." Sarah wanted to disagree, to offer reassurance, but the truth pressed too heavily to ignore. It did look scary. It looked like the kind of place where hope went to collapse and be forgotten. "We're just going to look around," she said. "That's all." They stepped out of the car together, Sarah's hand finding Emma's automatically. The air smelled different here, earthy and metallic, with an undertone of something older. Decay, perhaps, or just the accumulated weight of time passing without purpose. Sarah pushed through the broken gate, testing each step before committing her weight. The ground was uneven, cracked pavement interspersed with patches of dirt and weeds that grew thick and wild. She led Emma toward the main entrance, a set of double doors that hung partially open, one still attached to its hinges, the other lying flat against the ground. Inside, the darkness pressed in immediately. Sarah pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the gloom just enough to reveal the outlines of what had once been a functional space. A reception area, she guessed, though nothing remained to confirm it. The walls were bare concrete, stained with moisture and streaked with patterns that looked almost deliberate. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, fragments of wood, pieces of metal whose original purpose was no longer clear. "Stay close," Sarah said, though Emma had not moved from her side. They walked slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. Doorways led to other rooms, some still accessible, others blocked by collapsed ceilings or piles of rubble. The facility had been gutted long ago, stripped of anything valuable or useful. What remained was a skeleton, the bare bones of a structure that had outlasted its function. Sarah felt the weight of the place settle over her, not as fear exactly, but as a kind of oppressive inevitability. This was hers now. This ruin, this burden. She tried to imagine what she could do with it, how she could turn this into something that mattered, but every thought circled back to the same conclusion. She had no money, no resources, no plan. They moved deeper into the building, following a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. Sarah's flashlight caught glimpses of rooms branching off to either side, most empty, some filled with refuse left by people who had used this place as shelter or storage or something worse. At the end of the corridor, a staircase descended into deeper darkness. Sarah stopped, peering down. The steps were concrete, still intact, but the air rising from below felt colder, heavier, carrying a dampness that made her think of basements and forgotten spaces. "Should we go down?" Emma asked. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But another voice, quieter and more desperate, reminded her that she had nothing to turn back to. No home, no savings, no safety net waiting to catch her if she fell. "Just a little bit," she said. "We'll see what's there." They descended carefully, Sarah keeping one hand on the wall for balance. The staircase turned twice, each landing darker than the last, until the flashlight was the only source of light. At the bottom, they emerged into a space that felt different from the upper levels. The air here was cooler, the silence deeper. The walls were thicker, reinforced, suggesting this had been designed for protection or containment. Sarah swept the flashlight across the room. It was large, the kind of space that might have held equipment or supplies during the facility's operational years. Now it was empty, or nearly so. Against one wall stood a row of metal lockers, their doors hanging open, their interior stripped clean. In the center of the room, a table lay on its side, one leg broken, the surface covered in dust, thick enough to write in. Emma pulled on her sleeve. "Mom, look." Sarah followed her daughter's gaze. Near the far wall, partially hidden by shadow, was a metal door. Not like the others they had passed, which were wood or had been removed entirely. This one was heavy, industrial, the kind designed to seal rather than simply close. Its surface was smooth except for a single handle and a keyhole that looked newer than the surrounding structure. Sarah approached slowly, the flashlight beam fixed on the door. There was no rust here, no corrosion. The metal was clean, almost maintained, not as if someone had cared for it long after the rest of the facility had been abandoned. She reached for the handle and pulled. It didn't move. Locked, as she had expected. She examined the keyhole, trying to guess what kind of key it would require. Modern, cylindrical. Not the older style she had seen elsewhere in the building. "What's behind it?" Emma asked. "I don't know." Sarah stepped back and scanned the rest of the room, looking for anything that might explain the door's presence. Her light caught on something near the base of the wall, a small panel, no larger than a notebook, set flush with the concrete. She knelt and brushed away the dust. Beneath it, she found a seam, then hinges. It was a cover, designed to conceal something. She pried it open carefully, revealing a shallow compartment inside. Empty, except for a folded piece of paper. Sarah lifted it out, the paper brittle but intact. She unfolded it slowly, the flashlight illuminating handwritten text in faded ink. The words were few, written in a hurried script. "Level 2. Access restricted. Emergency use only." Level 2. Sarah looked around the room, then back at the door. This was Level 1, she realized. The basement she stood in was only the beginning. There was something deeper. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing. The facility was larger than she had thought, extending below the surface in ways that weren't visible from above. And that door, locked and maintained, suggested someone had known about it, had protected it, perhaps recently. Emma tugged on her sleeve again. "Can we go back up? It's cold." Sarah nodded, though part of her wanted to stay, to search for a way past the door, to understand what lay beyond it. But Emma was shivering, and the darkness pressed in too heavily to ignore. They climbed the stairs together, retracing their steps through the corridor and out into the fading daylight. The air outside felt warmer, less oppressive, though the sight of the crumbling facility did little to lift Sarah's spirits. As they walked back toward the car, Sarah noticed something she had missed before. Near the edge of the property, partially hidden by overgrown weeds, was a small structure. A shed, perhaps, or a guardhouse. Its roof had collapsed on one side, but the walls still stood. She led Emma toward it, curiosity overriding caution. The door hung loose, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered, filled with rusted tools, broken furniture, and piles of debris that had accumulated over years of neglect. But in the corner, half buried beneath a tarp, Sarah saw something that made her pause. A metal case, smaller than a suitcase, its latches still intact. She pulled it free and set it on the ground, brushing away the dust. It was heavy, solidly built, the kind of container designed to protect its contents. She opened it carefully, not knowing what to expect. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a set of keys. Dozens of them, each labeled with numbers and letters that meant nothing to her. She sorted through them slowly, her fingers moving over the cold metal until she found one marked L2, Primary. Level 2. Primary Access. Sarah stared at the key, her heart beating faster. Someone had left this here deliberately, hidden but not destroyed. Someone had known she, or someone like her, might come looking. She closed the case and stood, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The facility no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. As she walked back to the car with Emma, the sun dipping lower toward the horizon, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A sense that the ground beneath her feet, crumbling and uncertain as it was, might still hold something worth standing on. The news of the inheritance spread faster than Sarah had anticipated. She had told no one, but secrets in small circles rarely stayed buried for long. By the time she returned to the motel that evening, her phone was lighting up with messages from people she hadn't spoken to in months. Her sister called first. "A military facility." Rachel's voice carried equal parts disbelief and concern. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" "I'm not thinking," Sarah said, exhaustion seeping into her voice. "I'm just trying to survive." "You can't raise Emma in a place like that. It's not safe. It's not even livable." "The motel isn't livable either," Sarah replied. "At least this is mine." "It's a liability," Rachel pressed. "What if something collapses? What if Emma gets hurt? Have you even had it inspected?" "With what money?" Sarah asked, and the silence that followed was answer enough. Rachel softened slightly. "Look, I know things are hard, but taking on a project like this when you can barely afford food, it's not practical." "Nothing about my life is practical," Sarah said, "but I have to try something." The call ended with promises to talk later, though both of them knew later would arrive with the same arguments dressed in slightly different words. The next call came from a former coworker, someone Sarah had worked with years ago before the layoffs. "I heard you inherited some old government building," the woman said, her tone bright with the kind of curiosity that felt more like entertainment than concern. "Are you going to turn it into something? Like a haunted house attraction or storage units?" Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the sound caught in her throat. "I don't know yet," she said. "Well, if you need help cleaning it out, let me know. My husband does demolition work. He could probably give you a deal." Demolition. The word settled heavily. That was what most people saw when they looked at the facility. Something to be torn down, cleared away, erased. But Sarah had seen the door, had felt the weight of the key in her hand. There was something there, something more than decay. The third call came from someone she didn't recognize. A man's voice, smooth and practiced. "Ms. Mitchell? My name is David Brennan. I'm a property investor in the area. I heard about your recent acquisition." "How did you hear about it?" Sarah asked, her guard rising. "Word travels," Brennan said easily. "I wanted to reach out because I have clients interested in properties like yours. Decommissioned facilities, large lots, potential for redevelopment. I'd like to make you an offer." "I just got it," Sarah said. "I haven't even decided what to do with it." "I understand," Brennan replied. "So, but let me be direct. Properties like this are more trouble than they're worth for most people. The costs, the liability, the time investment, it's overwhelming. I can take it off your hands for a fair price and save you the headache." "How much?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't matter. $5,000, Brennan said. Cash, quick closing. $5,000. It was more money than Sarah had seen in months, more than enough to buy time, to find a better motel, to keep Emma's prescriptions filled while she searched for steady work. But it was also nothing. $5,000 for a facility that size, for land that stretched farther than she had walked, for whatever lay behind that locked door. Even without knowing what was there, Sarah understood the offer was designed to prey on desperation rather than reflect value. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Brennan replied, though his tone suggested he had already anticipated her refusal. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. These opportunities don't stay available forever." When the call ended, Sarah sat on the edge of the motel bed, Emma asleep beside her, and stared at the cracked screen of her phone. Everyone wanted her to walk away. Everyone saw the facility as a burden, a mistake, something to discard before it dragged her down further. But Sarah had spent too long being told what was practical, what made sense, what people like her should or shouldn't do. She had followed the rules, worked the jobs, made the safe choices, and still ended up here, homeless and desperate, with a sick child, and no clear path forward. The key sat on the nightstand, small and unremarkable. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers, feeling its weight, its solidity. It was real. Whatever it unlocked was real. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than the slow suffocation of defeat. She would go back. She would open that door. And whatever she found there, good or bad, would be hers to face. The decision to return came not from courage, but from the absence of alternatives. Sarah had $43 left in her bank account, 3 days remaining on the motel room, and a prescription refill for Emma that would cost $120. The math was simple and unforgiving. She spent the next morning calling local services, trying to find anything that might provide temporary relief. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Sympathetic voices, bureaucratic explanations, waiting lists that stretched months into the future. She was told to apply for assistance, to fill out forms, to provide documentation she no longer had. By noon, she had exhausted her options. Emma sat on the bed, coloring in a book she had found in the motel lobby, her movements careful and deliberate. She was a quiet child, observant in ways that suggested she understood more than she was told. "Are we going back to that place?" Emma asked, without looking up from her drawing. "Yes," Sarah said. Why? It was a fair question, one Sarah had been asking herself. "Because it's ours," she said finally, "and sometimes you have to work with what you have." Emma nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense, and went back to coloring. They left an hour later, the car protesting the journey with sounds that grew louder as they left the city behind. Sarah drove with one eye on the road and one on the temperature gauge, willing the engine to hold together long enough to reach the facility and return. The trees thickened as they approached, the narrow dirt road winding through forest that felt older and denser than the landscape around the motel. The facility appeared again, unchanged, its walls and fences still bearing the marks of decades spent abandoned. This time, Sarah did not hesitate. She parked near the gate and gathered what she had brought: a stronger flashlight borrowed from a neighbor, a crowbar she had found in the motel parking lot, and the key. Emma followed without question, her small hand finding Sarah's as they walked toward the main building. The interior was as dark as before, but Sarah moved with more confidence now, retracing the path they had taken the previous day. The stairs descended into coolness and shadow, each step echoing softly. At the bottom, the metal door waited, its surface gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. Sarah inserted the key. It turned smoothly, the lock disengaging with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. She pulled the handle, and the door swung open, revealing a corridor beyond. The air that escaped was cooler still, dry rather than damp, carrying no smell of decay or neglect. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her flashlight illuminating walls that looked cleaner, more maintained than anything she had seen upstairs. "What's down there?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," Sarah said. "But we're going to find out." They stepped through the door together, leaving the crumbling world above behind, descending into a space that had been waiting in darkness for someone to finally ask the right questions. The corridor stretched forward, longer than Sarah had expected, its walls smooth and featureless, except for the occasional seam where panels met. The floor beneath her feet was concrete, level and solid, showing none of the damage that marked the upper levels. This space had been protected, sealed away from the weather and decay that had consumed everything else. Emma's hand tightened around hers as they walked, their footsteps creating soft echoes that traveled ahead of them and disappeared into the dark. Sarah kept the flashlight beam focused forward, resisting the urge to look back, to second-guess the decision that had brought them here. The corridor ended at another door, this one simpler, unmarked. Sarah pushed it open and found herself in a room that made her stop completely. It was large, far larger than the basement level above. The space extended in multiple directions, divided by rows of metal shelving that stood like sentinels in the darkness. And on those shelves, stacked with meticulous care, were containers. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, each one sealed and labeled with codes that meant nothing to her. Sarah moved closer, her flashlight sweeping across the nearest shelf. The containers were uniform, military grade, designed to protect their contents from time and elements. She lifted one down carefully, surprised by its weight, and examined the label. Numbers, letters, a date from decades ago. She set it on the floor and opened it slowly, not knowing what to expect. Inside, wrapped in protective material, were documents, official papers, forms filled out in precise handwriting, reports stamped with seals and signatures. She recognized none of it specifically, but the weight of bureaucracy and authority was unmistakable. She moved to the next container and found more of the same. Documents, records, files that had been archived with a care that suggested they were meant to be preserved, not destroyed. This was not abandoned storage. This was deliberate. Sarah worked methodically, opening container after container, her movements becoming automatic as the pattern revealed itself. The room was an archive, a repository of information that someone had gone to great lengths to protect. And it had been sealed beneath a crumbling facility that no one wanted, hidden in plain sight. As she reached the back of the room, her flashlight caught something different. Against the far wall, separate from the shelves, stood a series of larger containers. These were not labeled with codes, but with a single word stamped across each surface. Classified. Sarah approached them slowly, her heart beating faster. She had stumbled into something beyond her understanding, something that carried implications she couldn't yet grasp. But beneath the confusion and the uncertainty, a single thought crystallized with absolute clarity. This facility was not worthless. Whatever lay inside these containers, whatever had been deemed important enough to hide and protect, it represented value that no one had expected to find again. She knelt beside the first classified container and examined its seal. Unlike the others, which opened with simple latches, this one required a code. A numeric keypad was embedded in the lid, its display dark but still functional. Sarah tried the obvious combinations: zeros, ones, the year printed on some of the documents she had found. Nothing worked. The container remained sealed, its contents locked away behind a barrier she couldn't cross. Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, I'm tired." Sarah looked at her daughter and saw the exhaustion in her small face. They had been here for hours, longer than she had realized. The darkness and the silence had a way of distorting time, making minutes stretch into something heavier. "Okay," Sarah said. "We'll come back." As they retraced their steps through the corridor and up the stairs, Sarah's mind raced ahead. The archive represented something significant, but she didn't know what or how to access it. She needed help, but asking for help meant exposing what she had found, and exposure carried risks she wasn't ready to face. By the time they reached the car, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that felt almost too beautiful for the day they had had. Sarah sat behind the wheel and looked back at the facility one last time before driving away. The building looked the same as it always had, crumbling and forgotten, But beneath it, hidden in darkness and protected by sealed doors, lay something that refused to fit the narrative everyone had accepted. Sarah turned the key in the ignition and felt the engine struggle to life. As they drove away, the facility shrinking in the rearview mirror, she made a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. She would not walk away. She would not sell. She would not let desperation push her into accepting less than what this place might hold. Whatever lay locked in those classified containers, whatever truth or value had been buried here and forgotten, she would find it. Not because she was brave, but because she had nothing left to lose. And sometimes, Sarah had learned, having nothing left to lose was the only kind of freedom that mattered. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both frantic and surreal. Sarah woke before dawn each morning, drove Emma to a free breakfast program at a community center, then made the long drive to the facility. She worked in the underground archive until early afternoon, documenting everything she could with her phone's camera, making notes in a spiral notebook she had found in the motel trash. At first, the work felt aimless, like organizing pieces of a puzzle without knowing what image they were meant to form. The documents were dense, filled with technical language and references to programs and operations she didn't understand. Military designations, budget allocations, personnel records that mentioned names but gave no context for who those people were or what they had done. But gradually, patterns emerged. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, project names that seemed to cluster around specific time periods. Financial transfers marked classified appropriation with dollar amounts that made Sarah's breath catch. Millions, sometimes tens of millions, moved between accounts that existed only as alphanumeric codes. She photographed everything systematically, creating a digital archive of the physical one, backing it up to a cloud service she paid for with the last $5 on a prepaid card she had been saving for emergencies. The irony was not lost on her. She was broke, homeless, and yet possessed of information that felt valuable in ways she couldn't yet quantify. On the third day, she found something that made her stop completely. A ledger, handwritten rather than typed, tucked inside a container marked with a date from 40 years ago. The entries were meticulous, listing items alongside values. Not operational values or budget projections, but appraisals. Precious metals, art pieces, antiquities, bonds, currency from multiple countries. The numbers climbed with each page she turned. 10 million, 30 million, 70 million. She reached the final entry and felt her hands begin to shake. Total estimated value, $322 million. Sarah set the ledger down and took several slow breaths, trying to steady herself. This was not a records archive. This was an inventory. And if the ledger was accurate, if even a fraction of what it described was still here, then the facility did not just hold information. It held wealth. She stood and looked around the room with new eyes. The classified containers suddenly felt heavier, more significant. If the documents she had already found were worth preserving, what lay behind those sealed lids? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Emma's school, calling to remind her that pickup was in an hour. Sarah had almost forgotten. Time underground moved differently, measured not in hours but in discoveries. She climbed the stairs quickly, her mind already racing ahead. She needed help, real help, from someone who could tell her what she was looking at and what it meant. But who? Lawyers were expensive. Appraisers required items to appraise. Government agencies would ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. As she emerged into the fading afternoon light, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Tire tracks in the dirt near the fence, fresh ones that had not been there that morning. Someone had driven onto the property while she was underground. Sarah walked to the tracks and knelt, examining them. Deep treads, wider than her cars, suggesting a truck or SUV. They led from the gate to a point near the main building, then back out again. Whoever had come had not stayed long, but they had been here deliberately. She pulled out her phone and took photos of the tracks, then walked the perimeter of the building, looking for signs of entry. Everything appeared undisturbed, but the unease remained. The facility was supposed to be hers alone. No one should know about it yet, and no one should care. Unless David Brennan, the property investor, had decided not to wait for her answer. Unless word had spread farther than she realized. Unless someone else knew what lay beneath the crumbling concrete and had been watching, waiting for someone to finally unlock it. Sarah drove to pick up Emma with one eye on the rearview mirror, checking for vehicles that followed too closely or appeared too often. Nothing stood out, but the feeling of being observed refused to fade. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Aunt Sarah sat at the small motel desk and opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dark room. She typed carefully, searching for information about decommissioned military facilities, classified materials, abandoned government property. The results were a mix of conspiracy theories, historical articles, and legal discussions about ownership and liability. But one thread caught her attention, a forum post from years ago written by someone who had worked in military archives. The person described protocols for handling classified materials, the layers of security, the ways information was categorized and stored. One sentence stood out. Anything classified above a certain level doesn't just disappear. It gets moved, sealed, and forgotten, but it never stops being protected. Not by the people who put it there, but by the people who don't want it found. Sarah read the sentence 3 times, feeling its implications settle over her. If what lay in the underground archive was truly classified, then its discovery would not be celebrated. It would be complicated, contested, possibly dangerous. She closed the laptop and looked at Emma, asleep under a thin blanket, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. This was not just about money anymore, if it had ever been just about money. This was about making a choice between safety and possibility, between stepping back into the familiar desperation or pushing forward into something she could not fully see. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She needed an expert, someone who could evaluate what she had found without immediately alerting authorities or claiming ownership. And after hours of searching online and making discreet inquiries through forums, she found a name. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a retired archivist who had spent 30 years working with government documents before leaving to consult privately. The phone call was brief. Sarah explained she had inherited a property containing old records, that she needed someone to help determine their significance. Dr. Chen's voice was measured, professional, with the careful neutrality of someone who had heard many strange stories. "I charge $500 for an initial consultation," Dr. Chen said. "That includes travel within a reasonable distance and a preliminary assessment." $500. Sarah had $38 left. The impossibility of it should have ended the conversation, but desperation had a way of making impossible things seem merely difficult. "I can't pay you up front," Sarah admitted. "But if these documents are worth what I think they might be, I can pay you more later." "Much more." There was a long pause. "What makes you think they're worth something?" "Because someone went to a lot of trouble to hide them," Sarah said. "And because the numbers I'm seeing don't make sense unless they're real." Another pause, longer this time. "Send me photos. Nothing sensitive, just enough to give me context. If what you have is legitimate, we'll work out terms." Sarah sent the images that night, carefully selected to show the organization and scale of the archive without revealing specific classified markings. She included a photo of the ledger's final page, the one with the $322 million figure, though she suspected Dr. Chen would dismiss it as fantasy. The response came faster than expected. A single line. "I'll be there tomorrow at 2 p.m. Send the address." Sarah read the message 3 times, trying to interpret its brevity. Excitement? Skepticism? Professional curiosity? She couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. Someone with expertise was willing to look, and that alone felt like progress. Dr. Chen arrived exactly on time, driving a practical sedan that looked better maintained than Sarah's, but still unremarkable. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and glasses that caught the light as she surveyed the facility. "This is it?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Yes," Sarah said. Dr. Chen walked to the fence and looked at the main building, her expression unreadable. "How long has it been abandoned?" 40 years, officially. But someone's been maintaining part of it. "Show me." Sarah led her through the broken gate, across the cracked pavement, into the darkness of the main building. She moved with confidence now, the path familiar, the stairs no longer uncertain. Dr. Chen followed without comment, her footsteps steady, her breathing controlled. At the locked door, Sarah used the key. Dr. Chen watched the mechanism turn, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That lock is newer than the building," she said. "I know." They descended into the archive, and Sarah watched Dr. Chen's face as the flashlight beam swept across the rows of shelving and containers. The woman's professional neutrality cracked, just slightly, replaced by something that looked like recognition. "How much have you opened?" Dr. Chen asked. "About a third of the regular containers. Oh, none of the classified ones." Dr. Chen moved to the nearest shelf and selected a container at random. She opened it with practiced efficiency, examined the contents briefly, then moved to another. Her movements became faster, more purposeful, as if she were confirming suspicions rather than exploring blindly. After examining a dozen containers, she stopped and turned to Sarah. "Do you know what this is?" "Documents," Sarah said. "Records of some kind." "This is more than records," Dr. Chen replied. "This is evidence, financial transfers, operational reports, communications between agencies. Someone created a parallel archive, probably for insurance or leverage. And then it got buried here when things went sideways." "Sideways how?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "That's not something I can answer without more context. But I can tell you this. What you have here is valuable, not just historically, but legally. There are people who would pay significant money to keep this hidden, and others who would pay even more to bring it to light." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "The ledger mentioned $322 million. Is that real?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "Show me the classified containers." They walked to the back of the room together, and Sarah pointed out the sealed units with their numeric keypads. Dr. Chen examined one closely, running her fingers along the seams, checking the integrity of the seal. "These haven't been opened since they were placed here," she said. "The seals are original, military grade. Whatever's inside has been preserved perfectly." "Can you open them?" "Not without the codes. And trying to force them would likely trigger fail-safes that could destroy the contents." Dr. Chen stood and brushed dust from her hands. "But if the ledger you found is accurate, and if these containers hold what it suggests, then yes. $322 million is not only possible, it's conservative." The words hung in the air between them, too large to process fully. Sarah had spent months scraping together dollars, rationing meals, choosing between rent and medicine. The idea that she was standing in a room containing hundreds of millions of dollars felt less like reality and more like a delusion born from desperation. "What do I do?" Sarah asked, and her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Dr. Chen looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "That depends on what you want. If you go to the authorities, they'll seize everything. There will be investigations, legal battles, years of process. You might get compensation eventually, but it will be a fraction of the true value, and it will cost you everything in the meantime. And if I don't? Then you need to be very careful. People who create archives like this don't do it for posterity. They do it for power, and power doesn't like being disturbed. Sarah thought of the tire tracks, the phone call from Brennan, the way everyone seemed to want her to walk away from the facility. Someone already knows, she said. Then you're running out of time to make a decision. Dr. Chen pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to Sarah. I can help you document and authenticate what's here. I can connect you with buyers, private collectors, people who deal in sensitive materials. But you need to understand the risk. Once you start down that path, there's no going back to being invisible. Sarah took the card and looked at it, the embossed letters catching the flashlight beam. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, private archivist and consultant. Below that, a phone number and an email address. Nothing more. How much would you charge? Sarah asked. 20% of whatever we recover. And before you say that's too much, consider that without me, you have no way to access or sell what's here. With me, you have a chance. 20% of $322 million was still more money than Sarah could conceptualize. Even 20% of a fraction of that was life-changing. But it also meant trusting someone she had just met, someone who now knew exactly what lay beneath the crumbling facility. I need to think about it, Sarah said. Doctor. Chen nodded. You should. But don't take too long. The tire tracks you mentioned? That means someone is watching. And once they realize you know what you have, they'll move to take it from you. They climbed back to the surface together, the sunlight feeling harsh after the cool darkness below. Dr. Chen walked to her car without lingering, her manner professional, detached. Before she left, she turned back to Sarah one last time. Whatever you decide, protect the key to those classified containers. That's the real value here. Everything else is just leverage. I don't have a key, Sarah said. Just codes I don't know. Dr. Chen smiled faintly. Then find them, because whoever locked those containers left a way to open them. They always do. The car pulled away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the failing light. The facility loomed behind her, silent and patient, holding its secrets the way it had held them for decades, waiting for someone desperate enough or foolish enough to try claiming them. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark motel room, listening to Emma breathe, thinking about Dr. Chen's words. The codes existed somewhere. Whoever had created this archive had left access, probably assuming they would return, or that someone they trusted would. She thought about the metal case in the shed, the one that had held the key to level 2. Someone had hidden it carefully, but not impossibly. They had wanted it to be found, eventually, by the right person. At 3 a.m, Sarah gave up on sleep. She sat at the desk and opened every photo she had taken of the documents, studying them with exhausted focus. Numbers appeared throughout the records, some obvious and meaningless, others repeated in ways that suggested significance. One sequence appeared more often than others. 19,660,812. At first, she assumed it was a date, August 12, 1966. But it appeared in contexts where dates made no sense, embedded in financial codes and personnel identifiers. She grabbed the spiral notebook and wrote down every instance of the sequence she could find. 12 times across different documents, always in the same format, always unmarked, but never explained. The next morning, despite Emma's protests about missing another day of school, Sarah drove back to the facility. She descended to the archive with purpose, moving directly to the classified containers. She knelt before the first one and entered the sequence. 196-60812. The keypad beeped once. The seal released with a soft hiss of equalized pressure. The lid lifted smoothly, revealing an interior that had not seen light in 40 years. Inside were objects wrapped in protective material, each one secured and labeled. Sarah unwrapped the first carefully, revealing something that made her hands still. Gold bars, smaller than she had imagined from movies, but unmistakably real. Heavy, dense, marked with stamps and numbers that indicated purity and weight. She set them aside and unwrapped the next package. Bonds, bearer bonds from foreign governments, each one representing currency that could be claimed by whoever held the physical certificate. She counted them carefully. 20, 30, 50. Each denomination printed clearly. $100,000. The third package contained diamonds, loose stones, wrapped individually, so each one caught the flashlight beam and scattered it into brilliant fragments. She had no way to estimate their value, but even to her untrained eye, they were significant. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the contents spread before her. This was just one container. There were 6 more, each one potentially holding similar treasures. The ledger had not been theoretical, it had been literal. She opened the second container with shaking hands. More gold, more bonds, plus something unexpected. Small, sealed vials containing what looked like rare coins. Ancient, historical, valuable not just for their metal, but for their provenance. By the time she had opened all 7 classified containers, she understood with absolute certainty that Dr. Chen had been right. $322 million was not an exaggeration. If anything, it was an underestimate. The materials here, properly authenticated and sold through the right channels, could exceed that figure significantly. Sarah documented everything with her phone, photographing each item from multiple angles, recording serial numbers, and identifying marks. The work took hours, her back aching, her eyes straining in the inadequate light. When she finally climbed back to the surface, the sun was low, painting the facility in shades of orange and shadow. She walked to her car in a daze, her mind unable to fully process what she had found. Halfway there, she noticed something that snapped her back to alertness. Another vehicle was parked near the gate, not Dr. Chen's sedan. This was a black SUV, windows tinted, engine idling. Sarah stopped walking. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his 40s, dressed in a way that suggested business, but not formality. Casual authority. He raised a hand in greeting, the gesture deliberately non-threatening. "Ms. Mitchell?" he called. "My name is Robert Harding. I work for a private security and acquisition firm. I'd like to talk to you about your property." Sarah's instinct was to run, to get in her car and drive away. But running would only delay the inevitable. If Harding was here, others would follow. "I'm busy," she said, keeping her distance. "I understand. But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Harding walked toward her slowly, hands visible, movements controlled. "You've stumbled into something complicated, something that was meant to stay buried." "It's my property," Sarah said. "I have the deed." "You have paperwork," Harding corrected. "But what's underneath this facility isn't covered by a deed. It's covered by classification protocols that don't expire just because a building gets abandoned." "Then why isn't the government here?" Harding smiled thinly. "Because the government would rather pretend this place doesn't exist. That's where people like me come in. We clean up messes that fall through the cracks." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Clean up how?" "By making everyone whole. You get compensated fairly. We take custody of the materials. Nobody asks questions that don't have good answers." "How much is fair compensation?" $2 million, Harding said without hesitation. "Cash. Immediate transfer. You sign over access, We handle the rest." $2 million. A month ago, Sarah would have collapsed at the offer. It was enough to solve every immediate problem, to build stability, to give Emma the medical care she needed without choosing between treatment and survival. But she had seen what lay beneath the facility. She had opened the containers. $2 million was not fair. It was a fraction, an insult dressed in pragmatic language. "No," Sarah said. Harding's expression didn't change. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. The materials beneath this facility are classified. Possessing them without authorization is a federal crime. If you refuse to cooperate, I make a phone call, and by tomorrow, you're in custody." "Then why offer me anything?" Sarah asked. "Why not just take it?" "Because legal proceedings take time. Time means exposure. Exposure means complications." Harding stepped closer. "You're in over your head. Take the money. Walk away. Let this be someone else's problem." Sarah looked at him, at the black SUV, at the facility behind her. She thought of Emma waiting at the motel. She thought of Dr. Chen's warning about running out of time. She thought of the gold bars heavy in their wrappings, the bonds with their precise denominations, the diamonds catching light. "I need time to think," she said. "You have 24 hours, Harding replied. "After that, the offer changes, and not in your favor." He walked back to his vehicle without waiting for a response. The engine purred to life, and the SUV pulled away, leaving Sarah standing in the dust it kicked up. She got in her car and drove back to the motel with her hands trembling on the wheel. The choice had been clearer when it was theoretical, when the money was a number in a ledger rather than a physical reality stacked in containers. But now, faced with both the treasure and the people who wanted to take it, Sarah understood that Dr. Chen had been right about more than authentication. This was about power, and power didn't negotiate. It took. By the time she reached the motel, darkness had fallen completely. She sat in the parking lot with the engine off, trying to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. 24 hours. She could take Harding's offer and secure Emma's future. She could call Dr. Chen and try to move the materials privately before Harding's deadline expired. Or she could do nothing and wait to see what came next. None of the options felt safe. All of them carried consequences she couldn't fully predict. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered warily. "Ms. Mitchell?" The voice was female, crisp, professional. "My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm an attorney specializing in property rights and government overreach. I understand you've received a visit from Robert Harding." Sarah's throat went dry. "How do you know that?" "Because Harding works for people I've dealt with before, people who make their living claiming things that don't belong to them." There was a pause. "I'd like to help you." "Why?" "Because what you found isn't just valuable, it's evidence. And evidence like that can change narratives, expose misconduct, force accountability. But only if it's handled correctly." "I don't have money to pay you," Sarah said, the admission automatic now. "I don't need your money. I need your cooperation. And in return, I'll make sure you keep what's yours, and that it gets used the way it should be." Sarah closed her eyes. Everyone wanted something. Dr. Chen wanted 20%. Harding wanted everything for almost nothing. Walsh wanted cooperation and evidence. And Sarah just wanted her daughter to be safe. "I need to think," she said again, the words feeling useless even as she spoke them. "You don't have time to think," Walsh replied. "Harding gave you 24 hours because he knows others are coming. Government agencies, private collectors, people who won't bother with offers. You need protection, legal and physical. I can provide both. But you have to decide now." The line went silent, waiting. Sarah looked toward the motel room where Emma slept. unaware that her mother was sitting in a parked car trying to decide between bad options and worse ones. "I'll call you back," Sarah said. "You have 2 hours," Walsh said. "After that, I can't guarantee I can help you." The call ended. Sarah sat in the darkness, her phone screen fading to black, and felt the weight of everything pressing down until she could barely breathe. She had found treasure. Real treasure. The kind that changed lives and solved problems and bought futures. But she had also found something else. She had found the truth that treasure never came free. It always carried a price, and that price was usually measured in more than money. The question was whether she was willing to pay it. Sarah sat in that parking lot for exactly 7 minutes before making her decision, not because the choice had become clear, but because Emma appeared at the motel window, her small face pressed against the glass, looking for her mother. That image, that reminder of why any of this mattered, cut through the paralysis. She called Catherine Walsh back. "I need your help," Sarah said, "but I need to understand what I'm agreeing to." "Fair enough." Walsh's voice carried no triumph, only focus. "Here's the situation. What you found is technically government property, but it was hidden through illegal means. That makes it contested. Harding represents private interests who want to claim it quietly. I represent public interest. We expose what happened, use the evidence to force accountability, and you get compensated properly through legal channels. How long will that take? Months, maybe a year. But you'll be protected throughout the process. And when it's over, now you'll have clear title to your compensation. Harding's money comes with strings. Mine comes with paperwork, but it's clean." Sarah looked toward the motel room again. "I can't wait months. My daughter needs medical care now. We need housing now." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "There are emergency provisions. We can get you immediate funds based on the estimated value. Not the full amount, but enough to stabilize. The rest comes when everything's authenticated and settled." "How much immediate?" "Based on what you've described, $250,000 within 72 hours. Enough to secure housing, cover medical expenses, buy time." It was more than Harding had offered initially, but still a fraction of the whole. Still, Sarah understood the difference. Walsh's offer came with legal protection, with a path forward that didn't require her to disappear or pretend she'd never looked beneath the facility. "What do you need from me?" "Documentation. Photos, descriptions, everything you've recorded. Then we file an emergency protective order, claim the materials under salvage and inheritance laws, and force the government to acknowledge the archive exists. Once it's in the legal system, Harding and his people can't touch it. And if they try, they won't. Not if we move fast enough." Walsh paused. "But Sarah, you need to understand something. Once we start this, your life becomes public. There will be media attention, questions, scrutiny. People will examine every part of your past, looking for reasons to discredit you. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about the eviction, the unpaid medical bills, the jobs she'd lost, and the times she'd chosen between food and rent. Her life was already a catalog of struggle. Letting people see it wouldn't change what she'd survived. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared." "Good. Send me everything you have. I'll have papers drawn up within an hour. And Sarah, don't go back to that facility alone. If Harding realizes you've chosen differently, he'll move to secure it himself." The call ended. Sarah immediately began uploading photos to Walsh's secure server, her phone's battery draining as files transferred one by one. When the last image uploaded, she felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but the sense that she had finally stopped reacting and started acting. She went inside and found Emma awake, sitting on the bed with her coloring book. "Are we okay?" Emma asked. And the question carried more weight than a 7-year-old should have to bear. "We're going to be," Sarah said, and for the first time in months, she believed it. The next 12 hours moved with controlled chaos. Walsh's legal team filed emergency motions with 3 different courts simultaneously, creating a legal web that trapped the facility and its contents in bureaucratic amber. By dawn, Sarah received confirmation that protective orders were in place. The facility was now officially under legal review, inaccessible to anyone without court authorization. Harding called at 8 in the morning, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You made a mistake." "I made a choice," Sarah replied. "A choice that's going to cost you everything. You think Walsh is your friend? She's using you for publicity. When this is done, you'll be lucky to see 10% of what that archive is worth. That's still more than the nothing you wanted to give me." Harding was quiet for a long moment. "You don't understand how this works. The materials you found don't legally belong to anyone. They were created through black budget operations, hidden to avoid oversight. There's no legitimate claim. Whoever has physical possession makes the rules." "Then it's good that possession is no longer the issue," Sarah said. "It's evidence now, protected by multiple courts." She ended the call before he could respond. Her hands were shaking, but beneath the fear was something harder, something that felt like resolve, calcified by months of having nothing left to lose. Dr. Chen called an hour later. "I heard you went with Walsh. That's good. She's aggressive. But she's honest. You know her. We've worked parallel cases before. She gets results." Chen paused. "I assume my consulting offer is off the table." "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "Walsh hasn't told me who she's using for authentication." "She'll ask me," Chen said with quiet confidence. "There are only 3 people in the region qualified to handle materials like what you found, and I'm the only one who's already seen it. When she calls, I'll tell her the same thing I told you, 20%. "That's—" Sarah started to protest, but Chen cut her off. "Fair, that's what it is. I'm not charging you for discovery. I'm charging you for expertise that turns what you found into what you can keep. Think about it." The call ended before Sarah could argue further. She sat at the small motel desk, her laptop open to a news site that had started covering the story. The headline was cautious. "Legal dispute emerges over abandoned military facility." But beneath the careful language, Sarah could see the shape of what was coming. Attention, questions, exposure. Her phone rang again. This time, it was her sister. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? Mom just called me screaming about you being on the news." "It's complicated," Sarah said. "Complicated?" "You inherited some building, and now there's articles saying it might contain classified materials worth millions. That's not complicated. That's insane." "I know." Rachel's voice softened slightly. "Are you safe? Is Emma safe?" "We're protected. Legally, at least." "That's not what I asked." Sarah looked toward the window, toward the parking lot where Harding's SUV had idled just yesterday. "I don't know yet, but I'm trying." The conversation drifted into familiar territory, concern mixed with criticism, love wrapped in frustration. When it ended, Sarah felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The next development came through Walsh. "We have a court date, 3 weeks from now. Both sides present evidence. Judge determines custody and compensation. In the meantime, we've been granted access to conduct a full inventory with independent oversight." "What does that mean?" "It means you, me, certified appraisers, and a court-appointed monitor go down into that facility and document everything. Every bar of gold, every bond, every piece of evidence. We create an official record that can't be disputed." "When?" "Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Bring Emma if you need to, but understand it's going to be a long day." Sarah arranged for Emma to stay with a neighbor from the motel, an older woman who had been kind, despite Sarah's circumstances. The next morning, She drove to the facility to find it transformed. Security fencing surrounded the property. Official vehicles filled the area where there had been only emptiness. Men and women in suits moved with purpose, carrying equipment and clipboards. Walsh met her at the gate, flanked by two people Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell, this is Gerard Paulson, certified appraiser, and Linda Yu, the court monitor. They'll be supervising today's inventory. The group moved through the facility like a small army, descending into the underground archive with professional efficiency. Portable lights were set up, turning the dark space into something clinical and bright. Sarah watched as strangers cataloged what she had discovered, their movements precise, their notes detailed. Gerard Paulson examined the first gold bar with instruments that looked more suited to a laboratory than an appraisal. He weighed it, tested its purity, photographed its markings. Genuine, he said finally. 1960s military issue. Current market value approximately $42,000 per bar. He repeated the process for each bar, his numbers adding up with mechanical certainty. 12 bars in the first container, $500,000 in gold alone. The bonds took longer to authenticate. Paulson conferred with specialists via video call, comparing serial numbers against historical registries. These are legitimate bearer bonds, he confirmed. Still valid, and still redeemable. Face value $5 million, but given their age and rarity, collector value could push it to $7 or $8 million. The diamonds required the most specialized equipment. A gemologist joined via video conference, examining each stone through Paulson's camera. Remarkable preservation, the expert said. These are investment-grade stones, flawless or near flawless. Conservative estimate, $12 million. Aggressive estimate, $18 million. The numbers accumulated throughout the day, each authentication adding weight to what Sarah had known, but not quite believed. By late afternoon, Paulson looked up from his notes, his expression carefully neutral. Preliminary total, based on the 7 containers we've examined, $287 million. That's conservative. Assuming minimum market value and standard authentication discount. Sarah heard the number, but couldn't quite absorb it. $287 million. Not the 322 from the ledger, but close enough to confirm that whoever had created that inventory had been precise. Linda Yu, the court monitor, spoke for the first time. What about the documents, the non-classified materials? Walsh answered. Those are being evaluated separately for historical and evidentiary value. That process will take longer, but initial estimates suggest another 15 to 30 million in value to collectors and institutions. The monitor nodded and made notes. I'll need to report all of this to the court. This significantly changes the scope of the case. How? Sarah asked. Because we're no longer talking about abandoned property. We're talking about assets that were deliberately hidden, likely through illegal means, and which now represent one of the largest undiscovered treasures in modern U.S. History. This isn't going to be settled quietly. The inventory concluded as evening approached. The underground archive was sealed with official locks, the court monitor retaining one key, Walsh another. Sarah was given a third, though its purpose now felt symbolic. The facility was no longer hers in any practical sense. It belonged to the process. That night, the story broke nationally. News outlets picked up the details leaked through court filings, and by morning, Sarah's face was on television. The coverage was split between fascination and skepticism. Some outlets framed her as a fortunate heir. Others questioned whether the treasure was real or an elaborate hoax. Sarah watched the coverage from the motel room, Emma beside her, both of them staring at a world that suddenly seemed interested in their existence. Is that really us? Emma asked. Yes, sweetheart. Are we famous? Sarah smiled despite the surrealism of it all. For now. But that's not the important part. What is? That we're going to be okay. The media attention brought complications Sarah hadn't anticipated. Reporters called constantly. Old acquaintances reached out with sudden interest. David Brennan, the investor who had offered $5,000, appeared on a local news segment, claiming he had tried to help Sarah, but she had been unreasonable. Her sister called again, this time apologetic. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. When you said you found something valuable, I thought. I don't know what I thought." "It's okay," Sarah said, though part of her wanted to point out that belief should have come before proof. The court hearing arrived with surprising speed, compressed by the public attention and the magnitude of the assets involved. Sarah sat beside Walsh in a courtroom that felt too formal, too distant from the underground archive where this had all begun. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many complicated cases, reviewed the filed materials with methodical focus. Representatives from multiple government agencies sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, their arguments prepared and rehearsed. They claimed the materials were government property, that Sarah had no legal claim regardless of inheritance, that the facility's contents should be seized and the archives sealed for national security reasons. Walsh countered with precision. The materials in question were hidden through illegal appropriation of funds. They were never officially recorded, never properly accounted for, which means they exist outside the normal chain of custody. Under salvage law and inheritance rights, Ms. Mitchell has clear claim to anything found on property legally transferred to her. The government's attorney objected. This isn't a shipwreck or abandoned cargo. These are classified materials that were protected by executive order. Protected or hidden? Walsh asked. Because if they were protected, someone would have come for them in the last 40 years. The fact that they remained undiscovered until Ms. Mitchell inherited the property suggests they were deliberately concealed from oversight, which undermines any claim of official protection. The argument stretched for hours, technical and dense. Sarah understood only fragments, but she recognized the shape of what was happening. This was not just about money. It was about whether people in power could hide their mistakes and then reclaim them when someone else found them. During a recess, Walsh pulled Sarah aside. "It's going better than expected. The judge is skeptical of the government's claims, especially given the lack of documentation. But we need to be prepared for a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" "You keep the financial assets, the gold, bonds, and valuables. The government retains custody of the documents for review and potential declassification. So you lose the evidentiary value, but you keep the treasure." Sarah thought about the documents, about the records of transfers and operations that someone had been desperate to hide. What happens to that evidence if they take it? Walsh shrugged. Depends on who gets control. It could be released, investigated, used to hold people accountable. Or it could be sealed again, buried under a different classification, forgotten for another 40 years. That's not fair. No, Walsh agreed, but it's realistic. The question is whether you're willing to accept it. Before Sarah could answer, they were called back into the courtroom. The judge had reached a preliminary decision. After reviewing the evidence and arguments presented, I am ruling as follows. The financial assets recovered from the facility, specifically the gold, bonds, precious stones, and collectibles, are the legal property of Sarah Mitchell under inheritance and salvage law. The government has failed to demonstrate legitimate claim or proper chain of custody. Sarah felt her breath catch. Walsh squeezed her hand beneath the table. However, the judge continued, the documentary materials will be retained under protective custody, pending review by an independent oversight committee. If those materials contain evidence of criminal activity or misconduct, they will be made available to appropriate investigative bodies. If they contain only operational records, they will be declassified and archived according to standard protocols. The judge looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, you are to receive fair market compensation for the financial assets, less appropriate taxes, and legal fees, within 60 days. Until then, the materials remain in secured storage under court supervision. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah said, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. The gavel fell. The hearing was over. Sarah had won, not everything, but more than she had ever imagined possible. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Walsh handled them with practiced efficiency, giving statements that were clear, but revealed nothing. Sarah stood to the side, watching her life be translated into sound bites and headlines. One reporter pushed through to address her directly. Ms. Mitchell, how does it feel to go from homeless to a fortune overnight? Sarah looked at the camera, at the lens that would carry her image to countless screens. It feels like something that should never have been necessary, she said. I worked hard my entire life. I did everything right. And I still ended up with nothing until I got lucky with something that was buried and forgotten. That's not a feel-good story. That's a failure of the systems that are supposed to protect people like me. The reporter blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Walsh touched her arm gently, guiding her away before more questions could come. In the car driving back to the motel, Walsh spoke quietly. That was good. Honest. It'll play well. I wasn't trying to play anything, Sarah said. I was just tired of pretending this is a fairy tale. Walsh smiled. That's why it was good. The 60-day waiting period felt longer than all the months of struggle that had preceded it. And Sarah moved from the motel to a modest apartment, using emergency funds Walsh had secured through the court. She enrolled Emma in a better school, closer to specialists who could manage her condition properly. The prescriptions that had once been impossible to afford became routine. But the waiting pressed on her. Each day brought new calls from people who wanted something. Interview requests, book deals, investment opportunities. Everyone saw the treasure, but few understood what it had cost to find it. Dr. Chen called regularly, her consulting fees now formalized through Walsh's legal structure. 20% still felt steep, but Chen's expertise had been essential in authenticating the materials. Sarah learned to think of it as the price of transformation, expensive, but necessary. When the 60 days finally ended, the transfer came through a series of wire notifications that lit up Sarah's phone throughout the morning. The amounts were staggering, incomprehensible. After taxes, legal fees, and Chen's percentage, Sarah's share came to $193 million. She stared at her bank account, at numbers that seemed too large to be real, and felt nothing at first. Not joy, not relief, just a strange emptiness, as if the struggle had been so foundational to her identity that its absence left a void. Then Emma came home from school, chattering about a field trip she wanted to go on, and Sarah realized the emptiness was actually space. Room to breathe, to choose, to build, without constantly calculating what could be sacrificed next. The first thing Sarah did was establish a trust for Emma's medical care, enough to cover any treatment for the rest of her life. The second was to pay off every debt she had accumulated, every eviction judgment, every collection notice, every unpaid bill that had followed her like shadows. The third thing was harder to quantify. She bought a house, not a mansion, but a real home with a yard and stable foundation. She hired lawyers to seal her eviction records, to clear the marks on her credit, to rebuild the paper trail of her life into something that looked less like failure and more like survival. She donated to the community center that had fed Emma breakfast during their hardest weeks. She established a scholarship fund for single parents trying to finish their education. She found the neighbor from the motel who had watched Emma that critical day and gave her enough money to retire comfortably. The media followed her transformation with the same intensity they had followed the discovery. Some outlets praised her generosity. Others criticized her choices, claiming she should have done more, given more, saved more people. Sarah stopped reading the coverage. She had learned that no amount of money would satisfy people who believed they knew how she should use it. 6 months after the court decision, Sarah received a call from an unexpected source. The Government Oversight Committee had completed its review of the documentary materials. Evidence of misconduct had been found, and investigations were being launched. The committee wanted to thank her publicly for bringing the materials to light. "No," Sarah said when the committee chair extended the invitation. "I don't want thanks. I want accountability." "We're working on that," the chair replied carefully. "Then let me know when you've worked on it successfully. Until then, I'd rather not be part of your press conference." The investigations moved forward slowly, as such things always did. Some officials were quietly asked to retire. Others faced formal inquiries that stretched for years. Sarah followed the progress with distant interest, satisfied that the evidence was being used, but unwilling to center her life around it. One evening, almost a year after she had first driven to the facility with Emma, Sarah returned to the property. It had been secured and maintained through the legal proceedings, but she hadn't visited since the court-ordered inventory. The chain-link fence remained, though it was now professionally installed and functional. The gate had a proper lock. She walked through the facility slowly, remembering the darkness and uncertainty of those first explorations. The main building was unchanged, still crumbling, still marked by decades of neglect. But the underground archive had been sealed officially, its contents removed, its purpose concluded. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs leading down to where everything had changed. She thought about the person she had been when she first descended into that darkness. Desperate, exhausted, clinging to hope that felt more like delusion. She thought about the person she was now. Secure, yes, but also aware that security was fragile, that fortune was as much about chance as merit. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty building, not to the treasure or the money, but to the opportunity it had given her to rebuild, or to choose, to transform. As she walked back to her car, a newer vehicle she had purchased after the transfer, she noticed wildflowers growing along the fence line. Small, persistent, blooming in soil that should have been too poor to support them. She smiled at the metaphor, at the way life insisted on itself, even in places that looked barren. Emma was waiting at home, having spent the afternoon with friends, a luxury that had once felt impossible. Sarah drove slowly, taking the long route, letting herself feel the weight of what had changed and what remained the same. She was not the same person who had answered that phone call from Gerald Hastings, but she wasn't entirely different either. She still worried about Emma. She still calculated costs, though the numbers were different now. And she still understood that wealth solved problems but created others, that money could buy security but not certainty. What had changed was simpler than that. She had choices now. And choice, Sarah had learned, was the real treasure. Everything else was just the means to protect it. The following week, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Her sister Rachel knocked on the door of the new house, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that mixed apology with hope. "I should have believed you," Rachel said without preamble. "When you told me about the facility, when you said there was something there, I should have trusted you." Sarah invited her in, and they sat in the living room that still smelled faintly of new paint. "You did what you thought was right," Sarah said. "I can't fault you for that. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology settled between them, not quite healing all the distance that had grown, but bridging some of it. They talked for hours, about the discovery, the court case, The transformation. Rachel admitted she had been scared, that watching Sarah struggle had felt like witnessing a car accident in slow motion, and that not believing in the facility had been a way to protect herself from watching it get worse. "I get that," Sarah said. "I really do. But Rachel, I needed you to believe in me when I had nothing. Believing now, when I have millions, isn't the same thing." Rachel nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know, and I can't undo that. But I can try to do better going forward." They left it there, a promise more than a resolution. Sarah understood that some relationships changed permanently, saw that money altered dynamics even between family. But she also understood that holding on to anger was a luxury she didn't need. Life continued its forward motion. Emma's health stabilized with proper treatment, her fevers becoming less frequent, her energy returning. She thrived in her new school, making friends, joining activities that had once been financial impossibilities. Sarah returned to work, not because she needed the money, but because she needed purpose. She started a consulting business, helping other people navigate complex inheritance and property issues, using the expertise she had gained through her own experience. The business grew slowly but steadily, built on reputation rather than necessity. She stayed in touch with Catherine Walsh, who had moved on to other cases, but checked in periodically. Dr. Chen became something like a friend, their professional relationship evolving into mutual respect and occasional collaboration. The facility itself was eventually sold to a developer who planned to convert it into storage units, the irony not lost on Sarah. The underground archive was filled with concrete, its secrets extracted, its purpose concluded. The land would serve a new function, unremarkable and practical. Sarah kept one memento from the entire experience, the key to Level 2, the one she had found in that shed so many months ago. It sat on her desk in a small display case, a reminder of the moment when everything had shifted, when she had chosen to open a door rather than walk away from it. People sometimes asked her if she would do anything differently, if she had known how complicated the discovery would become. Aunt Sarah's answer was always the same. "I would have brought a better flashlight." The joke usually landed well, deflecting the weight of the question. But in quiet moments, Sarah thought about the real answer, the one she couldn't easily explain. She wouldn't change anything because the difficulty had been part of the transformation. Easy wealth would have felt hollow. The struggle, the risk, the choice to persist despite every voice telling her to stop, that was what gave the outcome meaning. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Sarah was contacted by a local news station requesting an interview. She almost declined, tired of being the story everyone wanted to tell. But the reporter was persistent, and Sarah eventually agreed to one final interview, a chance to close the chapter publicly. And the interview was conducted at the new house, in the living room, with afternoon light streaming through windows that looked out on a yard where Emma played. The reporter, a young woman with earnest eyes and careful questions, asked about the discovery, the court battle, the transformation. Sarah answered honestly, without embellishment. She talked about being homeless, about the desperation that had made her accept a property everyone else dismissed. She talked about the fear of opening those containers, the weight of the decisions that followed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just walked away?" the reporter asked. "If you had refused the inheritance or sold it to one of the early buyers?" Sarah looked toward the window, toward Emma's silhouette against the bright yard. "I think about it sometimes, but I don't regret choosing differently, because walking away would have been safe, and safety wasn't what I needed. I needed a chance. And that facility, as ruined and complicated as it was, gave me that chance." What would you say to other people facing impossible choices? People who feel like they have no good options? Sarah smiled faintly. "I'd say that sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad. It's between giving up and trying one more time. And that trying, even when it feels foolish, is its own kind of courage. The interview aired a week later, edited to its most compelling moments. Sarah watched it once, then moved on. The story was told. The chapter was closed. What remained was not the treasure or the discovery, but the life she was building with the freedom it had bought. Emma's 8th birthday came in the spring. I'd celebrated with a party that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. Friends came, laughter filled the house, and for a few hours, Sarah allowed herself to simply be present, to enjoy the ordinary miracle of a healthy child surrounded by joy. That night, after everyone had left and Emma was asleep, Sarah sat on the back porch of her house and looked up at the stars. The sky was clear, the air warm with the promise of summer. She thought about the facility, about the darkness beneath its crumbling walls, about the moment when her flashlight had caught the outline of that locked door. One choice, one key, one decision to open rather than close. It seemed so small in retrospect, but it had been everything. Sarah finished her tea and went inside, locking the door behind her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to shape the life she wanted, rather than accept the life circumstance had given her. The treasure had made that possible, but the real fortune, she understood now, was simpler than gold, or bonds, or hidden wealth. It was agency, the power to choose, the freedom to try. And that, Sarah knew, was something worth more than any amount of money could measure. 3 years had passed since the courtroom decision, and Sarah stood in a conference room that overlooked the city, waiting for a meeting she had both anticipated and dreaded. The government investigation into the documentary materials had finally concluded, and the committee chair had requested this private briefing before the public announcement. The door opened, and Director Margaret Calloway entered, carrying a thick folder stamped with classifications that had recently been downgraded. She was in her late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating bureaucratic complexity. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming," Calloway said, extending her hand. Sarah shook it, noting the formality. "You said you had findings to share." Calloway set the folder on the table and opened it carefully. "The documents you discovered led us down a path we didn't expect. What started as a review of financial irregularities became something much larger." She pulled out several pages, each one marked with dates and names that meant nothing to Sarah. "The archive you found was created by a network of mid-level officials across 3 agencies. They were skimming from black budget operations, small amounts at first, but over 15 years it accumulated into the assets you discovered." $300 million is small? Sarah asked. "Spread across that many operations in that much time?" Yes. The genius of it was the scale. No single theft was large enough to trigger alarms. They were patient, methodical, and they documented everything as insurance against each other. Calloway flipped to another section. "When the political climate shifted in the early 80s, they panicked. The archive was created as a dead man's switch. If anyone in the network was exposed, the documents would surface and bring everyone down together. It was mutually assured destruction, bureaucratic style." "But no one ever pulled the trigger," Sarah said. "No. They all retired quietly, took their pensions, and assumed the archive would stay buried. Your uncle, Don Thomas Mitchell, was the nephew of one of the conspirators. He inherited the facility as a final favor, a place to store what couldn't be destroyed, but had to be hidden." Sarah absorbed this slowly. "So my uncle knew what was there?" "We believe so, yes. But by the time he died, most of the original conspirators were dead too. He left it to you not as a gift, but as a problem he couldn't solve and couldn't bear to pass to anyone he cared about more." The assessment stung, though Sarah had suspected something similar. Thomas Mitchell hadn't known her well enough to care what burden he placed on her. She had simply been available. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Calloway closed the folder. "We're announcing the findings next week. Several estates will be subject to recovery proceedings. We can't prosecute the dead, but we can recover what they took. That money will go back to the agencies they stole from, into programs that were underfunded because of their theft. And the public report? We'll mention you by name as the individual who discovered the archive and brought it to light. You'll be cited as acting in the public interest." Calloway paused. "There will be renewed media attention. I wanted to warn you before it starts again." Sarah nodded, already anticipating the calls, the requests, the reopening of a chapter she had tried to close. "I appreciate the warning." As she prepared to leave, Calloway added one more thing. "For what it's worth, what you did mattered. This wasn't just about money. It was about accountability, even delayed accountability. You could have taken Harding's offer and no one would have blamed you. The fact that you didn't says something important." Sarah left the building and walked to where her car was parked, turning Calloway's words over in her mind. Accountability. The concept felt abstract when balanced against the concrete reality of Emma's medical bills and the months they had spent in that motel. But she understood what Calloway meant. Some choices rippled outward in ways money couldn't measure. The foundation Sarah had established took up an entire floor of a modest office building downtown. The walls were decorated with photos of families who had been helped, single parents who had received emergency housing, children who had gotten medical care that would have been impossible otherwise. Sarah visited twice a week, more when specific cases required her attention. Today, she was meeting with her foundation director, Marcus Chen, Dr. Elizabeth Chen's nephew, who had proven to have his aunt's sharp mind and her commitment to getting details right. "We have 17 new applications this week," Marcus said, spreading files across the conference table. "Most are standard, emergency housing or medical assistance, but this one is different." He handed Sarah a folder. Inside was an application from a woman named Teresa Vance, 43, recently divorced, with 2 children and a diagnosis that had depleted her savings before she lost her health insurance. The details were painfully familiar. "She's 3 weeks from eviction," Marcus continued. "Her youngest needs surgery that's been delayed twice already. She's working 2 jobs, but it's not enough." Sarah read through the application carefully, noting the dates, the amounts, the desperate precision of someone trying to document their way out of an impossible situation. "Approve it. Full assistance package. Housing, medical, job placement support." Marcus made a note. "I thought you'd say that. She reminds you of someone." "She reminds me of half the country," Sarah replied. "People who do everything right and still end up with nothing." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, looking at Teresa Vance's application. The photo attached showed a woman with tired eyes and a forced smile, the expression of someone who had learned to perform optimism while drowning in fear. Sarah knew that expression. She had worn it herself for months, years even. The foundation couldn't save everyone, but it could save enough people that the gesture mattered. Each family housed, each medical bill paid, and each crisis averted was a small correction to a system that seemed designed to punish vulnerability. She thought about the people who had criticized her choices, who had argued she should have given away more of the fortune, who seemed to believe that having money created an obligation to solve every problem she encountered. Sarah had learned to ignore those voices. The foundation was generous, but it was also sustainable. She had no intention of burning through the treasure trying to fix a world that would remain broken regardless. Emma's 10th birthday party was smaller than the 8th had been, focused on close friends rather than the spectacle of celebration. She was growing into a thoughtful child, observant and occasionally too perceptive for her age. The chronic condition remained manageable with proper treatment, and the fevers that had once terrified Sarah were now rare enough to feel like distant memories. After the guests left and the house returned to quiet, Emma found Sarah in the kitchen, cleaning up plates and gathering discarded decorations. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always," Sarah said. "Do you ever wish we hadn't found the treasure? Like, do you ever think about what life would be like if we'd just stayed at the motel?" Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter, surprised by the question's depth. "Why do you ask?" Emma shrugged, the gesture trying for casualness but not quite achieving it. "Some kids at school said we're only rich because we got lucky, that we didn't earn it like their parents did. And I didn't know what to say because it's kind of true, isn't it?" Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for Emma to join her. "It's true that we got lucky. I won't pretend otherwise. But luck isn't the whole story. What's the rest of it? The rest is that I chose to look when everyone told me the facility was worthless, when investors offered pennies and experts said to walk away. I chose to explore anyway. Luck put the treasure there, but choice is what found it." Emma considered this. "But what if you hadn't been desperate? What if we'd had money already? Would you still have taken the facility?" It was a sophisticated question, one that cut to the heart of something Sarah had thought about often. "Probably not," she admitted. "Desperation made me brave in ways security never would have. But Emma, here's what I want you to understand. The kids who say we didn't earn this, their parents probably inherited advantages too, or connections, education, safety nets they never had to think about. We just inherited ours in a more dramatic way. So everyone's lucky in different ways? Something like that. The difference is being honest about it." Sarah reached across the table and took Emma's hand. "You didn't choose to be born into struggle any more than you chose to benefit from the treasure. But you get to choose what you do with the opportunity it created. That's where earning it happens." Emma nodded slowly, processing. "I think I want to help people like we were, when I'm older." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Then we'll figure out how to make that possible." The facility's transformation was completed in the 4th year after the discovery. The developer had converted it into climate-controlled storage units, the irony of which Sarah appreciated more than most. What had once hidden treasure now stored ordinary belongings, furniture, and seasonal decorations, and boxes of memories people couldn't quite discard. Sarah attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the developer's invitation, curious to see how the place looked now that its secrets had been extracted. The crumbling exterior had been reinforced and cleaned, the rusted fences replaced with modern security barriers. The entrance, where she had first stepped into darkness, was now brightly lit and welcoming. The developer, a man named Richard Moss, greeted her warmly. "This place has quite a history now. I'm thinking about adding a small plaque, acknowledging what was found here. Would you be comfortable with that?" Sarah considered it. "As long as it's factual and doesn't make it sound like a tourist attraction." "Agreed. Something simple. Site of historical discovery, 2020-something. Nothing sensational." They walked through the facility together, Moss pointing out improvements and modifications. The upper levels had been divided into rental units of various sizes. The stairwell that had led to the underground archive had been sealed permanently, filled with concrete, as the court had mandated. "Do you ever think about what's down there now?" Moss asked. "Sealed away?" "Sometimes," Sarah said. "But it's better this way. Some doors are meant to stay closed once you've taken what they were protecting." Near the back of the building, in what had been a corridor she had explored with nothing but a flashlight and hope, Sarah paused. The walls were clean now, painted white, lined with numbered units. But she could still see the ghost of what it had been, the decay and darkness that had nearly convinced her to turn back. "I spent 3 hours in this hallway once," she said quietly, trying to decide if I should keep going or give up. I was so tired, so scared, and I kept thinking that this was probably a waste of time, that I was chasing nothing. But you kept going, Moss said, because I had nothing to lose. That's not bravery. That's just the math of desperation. Moss was quiet for a moment. I think you're wrong about that. Plenty of desperate people give up. You chose differently. As they completed the tour and returned to the entrance, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't expected. The facility was no longer hers in any meaningful way. It had been transformed, repurposed, stripped of the mystery that had defined it. And that felt right. Places, like people, deserved the chance to become something new. 5 years after the discovery, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on inheritance law and property rights. She had declined similar invitations before, uncomfortable with being positioned as an expert when her knowledge came from experience rather than education. But this conference was different. It was focused on helping people navigate complex inheritance issues, and the organizers promised her story would be used to illustrate possibility rather than spectacle. She stood backstage, listening to the introduction being delivered to an audience she couldn't yet see. The words were familiar, carefully selected from the public record. Homeless single mother, abandoned facility, $287 million discovery, vindication. The narrative had been refined over time into something clean and inspirational, stripped of the terror and uncertainty that had accompanied each step. Sarah had learned not to correct these omissions. People wanted the story they could use, not the one that had actually happened. When she walked onto the stage, the applause was warm, but not overwhelming. This was not a crowd seeking entertainment. They were lawyers, estate managers, archivists, people who dealt with inheritance complications professionally. They wanted substance. Sarah adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. "I'm going to tell you something the news articles don't usually mention," she began. "When I first drove to that facility, I was hoping to find something I could sell for scrap metal, maybe a few $100s, enough to buy another week at the motel and refill my daughter's prescriptions." The audience was silent, attentive. I had no plan. I had no expertise. What I had was a key I'd found by accident, and a certainty that if I didn't try, I'd regret it forever. That's not a strategy I'd recommend to anyone. But it's the truth. She spoke for 20 minutes, describing not the treasure itself, but the decisions that surrounded it. The choice to hire Dr. Chen despite having no money. The choice to trust Catherine Walsh over taking Harding's immediate offer. The choice to let the government review the documents rather than trying to keep everything. Each decision felt impossible at the time, Sarah said. But looking back, I realized they were only impossible if I assumed I deserved nothing. And once I accepted that I had as much right to that treasure as anyone else who might claim it, the decisions became clearer. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the third row raised her hand. "How did you deal with people who said you didn't deserve the money? That it was just luck?" Sarah smiled. I agreed with them. It was luck. But I also pointed out that most wealth is luck in some form. Luck of birth, luck of opportunity, luck of timing. We've just decided that some kinds of luck are more legitimate than others. I got lucky finding treasure. Someone else gets lucky being born into a wealthy family. The money spends the same. Another question came from an older man near the back. "Do you think the system worked? Did justice prevail?" Sarah took a moment before answering. "The system worked for me because I had nothing to lose, and I got exceptionally lucky multiple times. But I met dozens of people during the legal process who were in similar situations and didn't get the same outcome. So, no, I don't think the system works. I think it occasionally produces acceptable results despite itself." The honesty seemed to surprise the audience, But Sarah had grown tired of pretending the treasure proved anything about fairness or justice. It proved only that sometimes, rarely, desperation and opportunity aligned in ways that created transformation. On the 7th anniversary of the discovery, Sarah received a letter from Teresa Vance, the woman whose foundation application had reminded her so strongly of her own struggle. The letter was handwritten, careful, expressing gratitude that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Teresa's daughter had received her surgery successfully. The family had moved into stable housing. Teresa herself had completed a certification program and found employment that paid enough to build savings rather than simply survive. The letter ended with a question. How do I pay this forward when I'll never have the resources you had? Sarah wrote back that same evening, her response longer than she had intended. She explained that paying forward didn't require matching scale, only matching intention. That helping one person with complete commitment mattered as much as helping thousands with distributed attention. That the foundation itself was just her way of doing what Teresa was asking about, finding a way to use fortune to create possibility for others. She ended the letter with something she had been thinking about increasingly as time passed. The treasure changed my circumstances, but it didn't change who I am. I'm still the person who spent months rationing medicine and choosing between rent and food. That person understood something important. Security isn't about having enough. It's about knowing you'll be okay even when you don't. I'm trying to create that security for others, not through money alone, but through the knowledge that someone is willing to help when systems fail. Sarah mailed the letter and felt something settle in her chest. 7 years ago, she had been standing in an underground archive, staring at gold bars and bonds, and trying to understand what they meant for her life. Now she understood they had meant very little on their own. The meaning came from what she chose to do with them, how she transformed fortune into purpose. Emma graduated high school at 17, having skipped a grade due to academic performance that surprised no one who knew her. She had inherited her mother's determination, but without the desperation that had shaped Sarah's early life. Emma had grown up secure, aware of the treasure's history, but not defined by it. At the graduation ceremony, Sarah sat beside her sister Rachel, their relationship having settled into something functional, if not fully healed. Rachel had apologized multiple times over the years, each apology more sincere than the last, but Sarah understood that some distances couldn't be fully crossed. "She's remarkable," Rachel said as Emma walked across the stage to receive her diploma. "She is," Sarah agreed. "You did that. The treasure helped. But you did it." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, rare from Rachel. "We both survived long enough for the treasure to matter. That's what I did." After the ceremony, Emma found Sarah in the crowd and hugged her tightly. "I got the scholarship," she whispered. "Full ride. They just told me." Sarah pulled back to look at her daughter's face, seeing joy mixed with relief. Emma had applied to study public health, specifically focusing on healthcare access for low-income families. The scholarship meant she could pursue that passion without the burden of debt. "I'm so proud of you," Sarah said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. That evening, as they celebrated at a restaurant Emma had chosen, Sarah thought about the invisible line connecting her daughter's future to that moment 7 years ago, when she had decided to descend into darkness with nothing but a flashlight and a key. Emma would never have to make choices born from desperation. She would never have to ration medicine or choose between food and safety. The treasure had purchased that freedom, had severed the chain of struggle that might have continued for another generation. And that, Sarah realized, was the real measure of the fortune's value. Not what it bought for her, but what it prevented for Emma. The ability to choose purpose over survival, passion over pragmatism, meaning over mere existence. As they drove home that night, Emma asked the question Sarah had been expecting for years. Do you ever go back? To the facility? Sometimes, Sarah admitted. Not inside, just to the gate. To remember. Remember what? That I was brave once. Not because I'm naturally brave, but because I had no choice. And that even when you have choices, being brave still matters. Emma was quiet for a moment. I want to be brave, too. But I don't know if I can be without being desperate first. Sarah reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. That's the gift the treasure really gave you, the chance to find out. The city lights blurred past the car windows, each one representing a life Sarah would never know, a story she would never hear, a struggle she couldn't solve. But Emma would try to solve some of them. And maybe Emma's generation would build systems that required fewer people to rely on buried treasure to survive. It was a small hope, but Sarah had learned that small hopes, accumulated and acted upon, could create transformation as meaningful as any fortune hidden in the dark. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.